Imagine this. A candle flickers in the darkness of the Tower of London, casting shadows on ancient stones that have witnessed betrayals, executions, and whispered confessions. But tonight, the silence is broken by a secret few dared to write down. Everyone knows the story of the princes in the tower, two young boys who vanished into history, leaving Richard III's name forever stained with blood. But what if I told you it wasn't just the princes? What if hidden behind those fortress walls was another victim, one not spoken of in polite circles, erased from history itself? Richard's own niece. Yes, the daughter of Edward IV, the young woman who might have been queen, the girl who stood between Richard and the legitimacy of his crown. Some say Richard plotted her marriage, others whisper he desired her for himself, and still others claim he destroyed her to secure his throne. This isn't the story you learned in school. This is the forbidden tale, the one chroniclers tried to bury, the one that could append everything we think we know about Richard III. And tonight, I'm going to tell you what happened inside those cold stone walls, and whether the princess in the tower truly met the same fate as her brothers. The first time you hear her name, it comes like a whisper across the centuries. Elizabeth of York. She was not just any princess. She was the daughter of King Edward IV, the niece of Richard III, and eventually the queen who would unite warring houses. But before her triumph, before her marriage to Henry Tudor, her life was one long, perilous gamble, and it begins the night her father died in 1483. Imagine the royal household in mourning, heavy velvet curtains drawn, courtiers moving silently in the halls like shadows. Edward IV, once a towering figure of strength, had been snatched away suddenly, leaving his 12-year-old son as the new king, Edward V. At that moment, the Yorkist dream teetered on the edge of collapse, because child kings rarely stayed safe for long. And Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the boy's uncle, stepped forward as protector. That word should have meant safety, but in England, protector often meant something else entirely: power. Elizabeth was 17 then, a young woman caught between grief and terror. She saw the tides turning faster than anyone else. Her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, panicked. She pulled her daughters and younger children into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, clutching at the altar as soldiers searched outside. She knew what happened when ambition ruled men's hearts. She had seen it before, and she feared that Richard's hand of guardianship over her son was less about loyalty and more about possession. The streets of London buzzed with rumors. Some said Richard was a man of honor, a loyal uncle. Others whispered of his ambition, his hunger, his calculating nature. And then came the thunderclap. The princes were taken to the Tower. It was customary, of course, for kings to stay there before coronation. But weeks passed. The coronation was delayed. The boys were seen less and less, until one day they weren't seen at all. For Elizabeth, every passing hour was a blade at her throat. She loved her brothers, yes, but she also understood what their disappearance meant. With Edward V gone, with Richard seizing the throne, her own future was no longer clear. She was suddenly dangerous, too royal, too close to power. And that is where the whispers began. Whispers that Richard wanted her. Picture it, a girl with long golden hair, walking cautiously through palace halls, eyes darting at every shadow. Every nobleman she passed weighed her not as a niece of the king, but as a pawn. If Richard married her, he could legitimize his claim to the throne. If someone else married her, she could become the rallying point for rebellion. Either way, her existence was perilous, and she knew it. One chronicler later claimed that Richard's wife, Anne Neville, fell into despair because she believed her husband planned to set her aside for Elizabeth. Imagine the jealousy, the tension inside the royal household. Anne was already sick, coughing blood, her health failing. And in that sickness, the rumor spread like wildfire. Richard, the uncle, was not just protector, he was suitor, a forbidden, scandalous suitor. And here's where the story darkens. Was Elizabeth truly in danger of becoming his wife? Or worse, his captive lover? Did Richard truly desire her, or was it a political maneuver twisted by gossip? What we do know is this: Elizabeth disappeared from public view during these months. Just as her brothers vanished behind the Tower walls, she too was cloaked in silence. For a princess born to wear a crown, to be hidden was almost as fatal as to be killed. Imagine her at night, pacing the stone chambers, hearing the muffled cries of her mother praying in sanctuary, imagining the faces of her lost brothers. Did she wonder if she would be next? Did she fear that every creak of a door meant Richard's men were coming for her? History does not tell us, but the silence screams louder than words. This chapter in her life is a fog of fear, loss, and half-truths. We know Richard claimed the throne. We know her brothers were gone. We know rumors tied her fate to his. And we know that, for a time, Elizabeth seemed to vanish into shadow. But was she the princess in the tower, hidden away until she too vanished like her brothers? Or was she something else, a secret survivor whose silence saved her life? The answer lies not in what was written, but in what was deliberately left unwritten. And as we close this first chapter, we stand at the edge of a precipice. Richard crowned king, Anne Neville wasting away, Elizabeth of York caught in the coils of power, a girl who might be both prize. The question that lingers, heavier than any crown, is this: what price would Richard pay to secure his throne? The summer of 1483 had the smell of iron in the air, not just from the smithies of London, but from the sharp tang of betrayal and blood. Richard had been crowned, and the city half celebrated, half remembered that 2 children had vanished into the depths of the tower. Bells rang, banners waved, but beneath it all lay an unease that refused to be silenced. The crown upon Richard's head gleamed like gold, stolen in daylight, and behind the cheers was the murmur of discontent. Elizabeth of York, no longer a child but not yet hardened by the world, lived in the center of this storm. Her existence was dangerous, her silence demanded, her future uncertain. Each day she rose with dread. The corridors she walked were lined with men who spoke her name in whispers. Her beauty compared to her mother's, her bloodline weighed like coin. If she were to vanish like her brothers, there would be no surprise, only shrugs of inevitability. And so she kept her head bowed, though her mind was never still. The chroniclers wrote of Richard as a king who governed with severity, but also with justice. They recorded his reforms, his courts, his proclamations, but they also wrote carefully, like men carving secrets into stone, of the scandal whispered in noble halls, Richard's desire for his niece. Some said he dreamed of setting a Neville aside, making Elizabeth his queen. Others claimed he wanted her in secret, locked away where no rebellion could claim her. And in the soft dark of her chambers, Elizabeth must have wondered, was she a bride-to-be or a prisoner in waiting? Picture the royal court at Westminster. Men in fine velvets, women with jeweled headdresses, gossip curling through the air like smoke. Every glance at Elizabeth carried questions. Would she wear the crown beside her uncle? Or would she be sent abroad, hidden in a foreign marriage, to neutralize her threat? She could not know. All she knew was that the eyes of the court followed her, and none of them with kindness. Anne Neville, Richard's queen, faded before their eyes. She grew thinner, her skin sallow, her breath ragged. At feasts, she touched her goblet with trembling fingers, eyes darting toward Elizabeth like a woman haunted by visions. It is said she wept when she believed Richard meant to cast her aside. The marriage bed that had once sealed the union of York and Neville now seemed a place of cold distance, while Elizabeth's presence ignited both rumor and dread. And yet, imagine being Elizabeth in those moments. Imagine the guilt pressed upon her shoulders. She did not seek this scandal, but her very existence was enough to unmake queens and stir kingdoms. Every word she spoke was dangerous, every smile too easily misread. So she learned to speak less, to smile less, to become a shadow, even in candlelight. Outside the palace walls, rebellion stirred. In the south, men loyal to her mother's family and to the vanished princes gathered arms. They claimed the true king lived, hidden in shadow, and Richard had stolen what was not his. Inside those palace walls, Elizabeth felt the tremors of war without hearing a single clash of steel. She was both prisoner and prize, her fate determined by men who called themselves loyal to one house or another. But there is one moment, preserved in fragments of memory, that casts the darkest light. It was said that Richard held private councils with Elizabeth, alone, behind closed doors. Was it merely a protector speaking with his niece, ensuring her loyalty, or was it something more? Chroniclers dared not say too much. Their pens shook with fear, but they left us enough to see shadows moving where there should have been none. The question that hung in the air was not only whether Richard had killed his nephews, but whether he intended something equally sinister with Elizabeth. Was she to be bound to him in marriage, an act both politically advantageous and morally abhorrent? Or was she to be removed, like her brothers, her bloodline erased so that no rival could rise against him? Imagine her heart pounding as she stood before Richard, his cold eyes measuring her, the silence between them thick as stone. He, the king with blood on his hands. She, the niece who might be queen. Did she fear him? Did she pity him? Or did she play her own game of survival, knowing that one wrong move could end her life? By early 1484, and Neville lay dying, and the rumors reached their fever pitch. People whispered that Richard had poisoned her, that he was clearing the way for Elizabeth. At court, eyes followed the princess with cruel certainty, believing she was to take her aunt's place. But fate, unpredictable as always, intervened. Anne died, and in the silence that followed, Elizabeth of York vanished again from sight. Was she hidden by her mother? Was she locked away by Richard? Or did she herself retreat, choosing survival over scandal? We do not know. History keeps its secrets tightly wrapped. What we do know is this: Elizabeth lived while her brothers did not, and sometimes survival itself is its own kind of accusation. As winter fell and Richard's court grew more brittle. Elizabeth was the silent flame no one dared to name, too dangerous to extinguish, too dangerous to let burn. And in the shadows of the tower, her fate twisted tighter around Richard's, in ways history may never fully reveal. And so Chapter 2 closes with a question as sharp as any dagger. Was Elizabeth of York Richard's pawn, his obsession, or his intended victim? The year 1484 bled into 1485 with the chill of uncertainty. And in that frozen season, Elizabeth of York became less a princess and more a shadow. A Neville was dead, her body carried out of the royal chambers, with whispers trailing behind it like mourners in black. The queen who once stood at Richard's side was gone, and now all of England turned its gaze toward the girl who remained, Elizabeth, niece to the king, daughter of a dead monarch, sister of vanished princes. For a time, she seemed to vanish as well. Chroniclers do not tell us where she walked, where she slept, whom she confided in. But in her silence, rumors shouted louder. Some said she had been hidden away in a convent, Richard too afraid of scandal to make her his queen, but too wary of rebellion to let her free. Others claimed she had been locked within the tower itself, the same cold prison that swallowed her brothers. And in taverns and market squares, bards sang that she had already been poisoned, her beauty and claim destroyed to secure Richard's crown. But Elizabeth still lived, and while Richard sat on his throne, tightening his grip with proclamations and laws, her very existence was a rebellion of its own. To the men who despised Richard, to those who whispered the names of the missing princes, Elizabeth was more than a girl. She was a banner, a symbol, a possible queen. Across the Channel, in the exile of Brittany, another figure brooded, Henry Tudor, thin-faced, long exiled, barely known in England, but carrying with him the distant claim of Lancaster blood. For years he had been a name more than a man, a pawn of French and Breton lords. But now, with the disappearance of Edward V and his brother, with Richard's crown stained by whispers, Henry's name grew sharper. And around that name gathered hope. Henry's mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, had ambition that could sear stone. She was the architect of his destiny, writing letters, sending secret messengers, stirring rebellion. And her eyes turned to Elizabeth of York. If Henry were to return, if he were to seize the crown, what could legitimize him more than marrying the daughter of Edward IV? What better way to unite Lancaster and York than in the body of a young woman who had already become the symbol of survival? Imagine Elizabeth, then, trapped between two fates. On one side, her uncle, the king, accused of killing her brothers and rumored to desire her for himself. On the other, an exiled stranger across the sea, promising salvation through marriage, but carrying with him the shadow of war. She had no voice in this, no freedom to choose. She was not a girl, not even truly a woman. She was England itself, torn between rival houses. Inside Richard's court, tension gnawed at the walls. He was not blind. He knew Henry Tudor gathered strength. He knew Elizabeth's presence fed rebellion like wood to fire. And so he struck first. In January of 1485, he swore before the council that he had never desired Elizabeth, that he had never plotted to marry her. He proclaimed her safe, his intentions pure. But proclamations are like smoke. They rise, they vanish, they do not still the fire beneath. For in denying the scandal, Richard admitted its existence. and the court whispered all the louder. Picture the hall of Westminster, banners sagging in the winter cold, Richard's voice echoing as he swore his innocence. Imagine Elizabeth, hidden behind stone walls, hearing his words but never trusting them. How could she, when her brothers had vanished in his keeping? How could she, when every look from a courtier reminded her that she lived only by Richard's will, and yet she lived? That is the truth that chills the spine more than any rumor. The princes did not, and Neville did not, but Elizabeth survived. Why? Did Richard see her as too valuable to kill? Did he believe her marriage would serve him later? Or did he, in some strange twist of heart, protect her even as he destroyed her family? History offers no clear answer, but Elizabeth's survival is not an accident. It is a choice, someone's choice, and choices always leave questions in their wake. By the spring of 1485, rebellion was not just whisper, but promise. Henry Tudor prepared to sail, his banners painted with the red dragon of Wales and the red rose of Lancaster. In secret, Elizabeth's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, left sanctuary and reconciled with Margaret Beaufort. Two women who should have been rivals clasped hands in conspiracy, plotting to wed their children and make them king and queen. Elizabeth of York, caught in this storm, became a ghostly bride long before she ever saw her groom. Her name was pledged, her body promised, her crown prepared, all without her consent. But in this game of thrones, choice was never hers to wield. She was both weapon and prize, and she must have known it. Now imagine her, 17 still, standing by the cold stone window of her chamber, hearing the bells of London, watching the grey Thames roll by. Somewhere across that water, men sharpened blades and whispered her name. Somewhere across the sea, Henry Tudor polished his claim with her future. And in the tower where her brothers once looked out upon the same city, silence reigned. She must have felt them close, their absence heavier than presence, their ghosts whispering in her ear. Would she join them in death, or would she avenge them in survival? The summer of 1485 brought war. Richard gathered his forces. Henry Tudor marched with foreign steel and English hope. And at the heart of it all, though she never lifted a sword, stood Elizabeth of York, the girl who was not supposed to live, the niece of the king, accused of killing his nephews, the princess in the tower, hidden, silenced, but alive. And as the armies drew near to Bosworth Field, as destiny sharpened its knife, Elizabeth must have felt the world closing in. Would she be queen or corpse? Would Richard drag her down into darkness, or would Henry raise her up into light? She had no way of knowing, but we do. And the answer is a story of war, betrayal, and the final breath of a king. This chapter ends not with Elizabeth's voice, for she had none, but with the sound of marching boots. Thousands of men, armed with steel and hope, converging on a muddy field where the crown of England would roll in the dirt, waiting for new hands to claim it. The summer sun burned hot on the fields of Leicestershire, and the air was thick with the stench of sweat, steel, and fear. It was August 1485, and everything, every rumor, every betrayal, every whisper in dark corridors came to its reckoning at Bosworth Field. For years, England had been torn apart by roses, red against white, Lancaster against York. But on this day, the battle was not only between two men, it was for the soul of a kingdom, and in the shadow of that fight stood Elizabeth of York, the girl who was no longer a child, but not yet the queen she was promised to be. Richard III rode out at dawn. He wore his crown upon his helmet, as though daring God to strike him down. His banner flew high, the white boar, defiant against the red dragon that Henry Tudor carried from across the sea. Richard was no coward, no weakling hiding behind men. He was fierce, skilled, a warrior king who believed destiny was his to command. But destiny has a habit of slipping through fingers the tighter one clenches. Henry Tudor marched with fewer men, his army patched together from French mercenaries, Welsh loyalists, and English exiles. Yet he carried with him something Richard could never match: hope. Hope whispered that the princes still lived, that justice would come, that Henry, through Elizabeth, would unite England once and for all. Elizabeth was not at Bosworth, yet her presence haunted the battlefield. Every man who raised a blade knew her name. They fought not only for Henry, but for the promise of her marriage, the fusion of Lancaster and York. The men in Richard's camp whispered her name too, though with bitterness. If Henry won, Elizabeth would be queen, and Richard's reign would be dust. The clash began with thunder, the shouts of men, the pounding of hooves, the hiss of arrows cutting the air. Steel bit into flesh, shields shattered, banners fell. Richard's forces outnumbered Henry's, but numbers mean nothing when loyalty trembles. For among Richard's allies stood lords who measured the wind carefully, waiting to betray him if the tide shifted. Richard, fierce and desperate, fought like a man possessed. He saw Henry across the field, and in a moment that has echoed through the ages, he spurred his horse, lowering his lance. He charged, not with caution, but with fury, determined to kill the pretender with his own hand. He cut down standard-bearers. He slew men in his path, until at last he came within reach of Henry himself. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might succeed, might end it all with one blow. But then came betrayal. Lord Stanley, whose allegiance had been uncertain, turned his men against Richard. Surrounded, outnumbered, Richard refused to flee. He fought on foot, swinging his sword with savage strength, until the mud itself seemed to swallow him. And there, in the chaos of blades, the last Plantagenet king fell. His crown tumbled from his helm, rolling in the dirt, stained with blood. The field went silent, except for the cries of the dying. Henry Tudor was lifted high, the crown found and set upon his head. England had a new king, not by right of birth alone, but by victory, and in that moment Elizabeth's fate shifted. She was no longer the niece of a usurper, no longer the rumored prey of a dangerous uncle. She was the bride of a conqueror. The girl who survived became the queen who would unite roses red and white. But survival does not erase memory. Imagine Elizabeth hearing the news in London, her uncle dead, his crown rolling in the dirt, his body stripped and carried ignobly. Perhaps she felt relief, perhaps dread. Did she mourn the man who was both family and rumored captor? Or did she whisper, thanks to the God who had spared her? We will never know. What we do know is that her silence remained unbroken, and silence can be louder than screams. Henry entered London to shouts of triumph. He declared himself king by right of conquest, but he knew his throne was fragile. He needed legitimacy, and for that he needed Elizabeth. The marriage was not just union, it was strategy. alchemy, the blending of red and white into a single rose. And yet, for months, Henry delayed. He wore the crown alone, careful to assert that he ruled in his own right, not through his wife. Elizabeth waited, her fate sealed, but not yet delivered. Meanwhile, Richard's body was displayed with cruel contempt, laid bare, humiliated, his back curved with the scoliosis that he had tried all his life to hide. For centuries after, his name would be dragged through mud, thicker than the field where he fell, and part of that stain would be his rumored lust for Elizabeth, the niece who lived while her brothers vanished. In the aftermath of Bosworth, Elizabeth was summoned. Imagine her walking into the hall, the eyes of Henry's court upon her, her golden hair bound with pearls, her beauty undeniable. Men bowed, women curtsied, but beneath their reverence was recognition. She was the key to everything. Without her, Henry was an invader. With her, he was England's destiny. And so the girl who once trembled in shadows now stood at the edge of a crown. But even in victory, the ghosts of the tower lingered. The princes were gone, Richard was dead, and Elizabeth, silent as ever, held her secrets close. Did she know what became of her brothers? Did she know what Richard had planned for her? Was she complicit in her own survival? History does not say. It only shows us that she endured, and endurance can be more powerful than any sword. The Battle of Bosworth was not just the death of a king, it was the death of an age. The Plantagenets were gone. The Tudors had begun, and at the center of it all, silent, watchful, destined, was Elizabeth of York, the princess who might have been a victim, but who became the queen of both roses. And yet, even as Henry prepared to wed her, even as England dreamed of peace, there remained one unanswered question. What happened to the princes? And if Richard had killed them, why did Elizabeth survive? The silence of history grows heavier here, pressing down like stone. And perhaps the answer lies not only in Richard's choices, but in Elizabeth's. The crown had been won at Bosworth, but victory did not mean peace. The year was 1485, and England was a nation wounded, her soil soaked in decades of blood. Kings had risen and fallen with the swiftness of seasons, and trust was a coin no one dared spend. Into this fractured kingdom stepped Henry Tudor, a man born of exile, suspicion, and ambition. And beside him, waiting in the shadows of history, stood Elizabeth of York, the princess who had survived when so many others had not. The coronation of Henry VII was swift. He rode into Westminster, the crown of Richard III placed upon his brow, the cheers of the city swelling around him. Yet beneath the celebration was unease. Henry's claim, though bolstered by victory, was thin. He was a Lancastrian, a branch long weakened by war and failure. To secure his rule, he needed more than conquest. He needed the blood of York. He needed Elizabeth. Imagine her entrance into court after Bosworth. 17 still, her beauty radiant, her bearing regal despite the storms she had endured. She was her father's daughter, Edward IV's living legacy, and to those who still loved the House of York, she was the true sovereign. Henry knew it, the lords knew it, the people knew it, and so did Elizabeth herself. She had been pawn, prize, whispered scandal, but now she was destiny. Yet Henry delayed. For months, Elizabeth waited in a strange limbo. Henry was crowned alone, crowned as king by right of conquest, making it clear that he did not claim the throne through her. He could not afford whispers that his power came from a woman. And so Elizabeth, though essential, was sidelined, her crown withheld. Imagine the bitterness she must have felt. After all she had endured. After the silence, after the losses, she was once again forced to wait. Finally, in January 1486, Henry relented. The marriage was announced, and the kingdom rejoiced. Red and white roses twined together, Lancaster and York united. Chroniclers speak of a great wedding at Westminster, bells ringing across London, banners fluttering in the winter wind. Elizabeth walked the aisle in robes of state, her golden hair braided with pearls, her face serene, though her heart must have thundered. When Henry took her hand, the realm seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The Wars of the Roses were, at least in appearance, over. But the ghosts of the Tower did not vanish. They lingered in every corner of Elizabeth's marriage, in every glance from the lords of England, in every whisper carried through the halls of Westminster. What had happened to her brothers? Had Richard killed them? Had someone else? Were they alive still, hidden away, waiting to reclaim their birthright? Henry could never rest while those questions remained, and Elizabeth could never forget the brothers who had been her companions in childhood and her shadows in womanhood. Henry, ever cautious, understood that Elizabeth's crown was both a blessing and a curse. She gave him legitimacy, but she also carried with her the weight of Yorkist loyalty. Should a pretender rise, a man claiming to be one of the lost princes, Elizabeth's bloodline would inflame rebellion. And so Henry kept her close, loved her perhaps, but also watched her. She was wife, queen, and symbol, but also potential danger. In the first year of their marriage, Elizabeth bore a son, Arthur, Prince of Wales. His birth was greeted as a miracle, the future of a new dynasty. For Elizabeth, it was both joy and reprieve. She had given Henry what he needed most, an heir. Yet, even in that triumph, the shadow of the Tower followed her. For, if her brothers still lived, Arthur's claim could be threatened, and if they were dead, their blood was on someone's hands, perhaps Richard's, perhaps another's, and the silence around their fate was deafening. Rumors erupted like wildfire in these years. First came Lambert Simnel, a boy paraded as Edward, Earl of Warwick, Elizabeth's cousin, though the real Warwick languished in the Tower. The rebellion was crushed, Simnel humiliated, but the message was clear. England was hungry for Yorkist blood, and Elizabeth's name remained a rallying cry. Then, more dangerously, came Perkin Warbeck. He claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, Elizabeth's lost brother, the younger of the two princes. He was charming, persuasive, and for a time he convinced kings and nobles across Europe that he was who he said. Imagine Elizabeth hearing his name, hearing that her brother had returned from the dead. Did her heart tremble? Did she dare to hope? Or did she know, with that silent knowledge history has never recorded, that her brothers were gone, and this man was but an impostor? Henry treated the threat with ruthless caution. Warbeck was paraded, shamed, and finally executed. Warwick, the true cousin, was beheaded as well, swept aside to end any doubt. And through it all, Elizabeth remained silent. She never spoke publicly of her brothers. She never claimed to believe Warbeck, never defended Warwick, never lifted her voice in rebellion. Her silence, once again, was her survival. But silence is not emptiness. It is weight. It is burden. Imagine Elizabeth lying awake at night, the cries of her newborn child in one chamber, the memory of her brothers in another. Did she dream of the tower, of their faces fading in the cold stone halls? Did she remember Richard's eyes, the rumors of his intentions, the questions that never left her? Did she wonder if her survival was blessing or curse? As Queen Elizabeth fulfilled her duty, she bore children: Arthur, Margaret, Henry, Mary. She smiled at court, stood beside her husband, played her role with dignity and grace. But always the ghosts walked beside her. The missing princes, the uncle slain in mud, the mother who schemed, the father who died too soon. Her life was survival stitched together with silence. And so the question of Richard's guilt remained unsolved. If he killed her brothers, why did he not kill her? If he desired her, why did he not marry her? If he protected her, why did he not speak in her defense? History leaves us only fragments, and Elizabeth herself leaves us only silence. Perhaps she knew more than we will ever uncover. Perhaps her silence was mercy, or perhaps it was complicity. By the end of chapter 5, Elizabeth is no longer the trembling girl hidden in sanctuary, nor the pawn of Richard's schemes. She is queen. She is mother. She is the rose at the heart of England's unity. And yet, the title she carries, the princess in the tower, haunts her still. For survival does not erase suspicion, and silence does not erase the truth. Elizabeth of York had endured the storm and emerged crowned. The years after Bosworth saw her transformed from pawn to queen, from silent witness to silent architect of a dynasty. Yet though her body sat on England's throne, her spirit carried scars carved by loss, betrayal, and unanswered questions. She lived in grandeur, but she lived with ghosts. Her marriage to Henry VII was a union of duty, not passion. Henry, cautious and calculating, rarely revealed the man beneath the crown. He ruled with suspicion, watching every courtier, every rumor, every whisper of rebellion. Elizabeth, by contrast, embodied grace. She softened the edges of his rule, brought warmth to the icy Tudor court. The people adored her. Chroniclers wrote of her kindness, her generosity, her beauty. She was the golden daughter of Edward IV, the living proof of unity. But beneath the gilded image lay a woman who had seen the tower's shadow and never truly left it. Each child she bore was a gamble against fate. Arthur, her firstborn, was the great hope of the dynasty. His birth celebrated with feasts and festivals. Margaret followed, destined to marry into Scotland's crown. Then came Henry, the spare who would become king in his brother's place. With each child, Elizabeth secured her husband's legacy, but with each birth, she also carried the weight of memory. She knew too well how easily children could vanish, how quickly crowns could slip from tiny heads, and vanish they did. Arthur, the Prince of Promise, sickened and died at 15. His loss struck Elizabeth like a dagger. She had watched her brothers disappear into the tower, and now she watched her son lowered into the earth. The echo was unbearable. History seemed to repeat itself in cruel rhythms. She wept not only for Arthur, but for the family she had lost long ago. The brothers who had never been given graves, the uncle who had died in mud, the father taken too soon in these years. Rumors refused to die. Pretenders still rose, claiming to be one of the missing princes. Though Henry stamped them out with executions and prisons, the whispers never stopped. Elizabeth's silence grew heavier. She never spoke of her brothers, never acknowledged the impostors, never revealed what she might have known. Did she know with certainty that they were dead? Did she suspect Richard? Did she blame him? Or did she carry a secret so terrible it could not be spoken? Imagine her walking through Westminster Palace, tapestries glowing with scenes of triumph, courtiers bowing, her children playing at her feet. To the world she was the picture of peace. But in the quiet of her chambers, when the doors were closed and the candles burned low, did she hear their voices still? Did she imagine Edward and Richard, the lost boys in the tower, calling to her from the shadows of memory? And did she ever fear that one day the truth would rise from the earth like a specter, demanding reckoning? Henry, for all his suspicion, grew dependent on her presence. She balanced his severity, soothed his paranoia, made the court believe in the Tudor dream. But he also controlled her, kept her voice subdued, ensured she never became more than symbol. Elizabeth bore it with grace. Perhaps she had learned from the Tower and from Richard that silence was the only safe weapon a woman could wield. Her final years were marked by tragedy. In 1503, she bore a daughter, Catherine, but the child died within days. Elizabeth herself grew weak, her body worn by years of childbirth and sorrow. She lingered only a short while before death claimed her at 37. The queen, who had survived sanctuary, suspicion, scandal, and shadow, was gone. Her death shattered Henry. Chroniclers tell us he locked himself away, refusing to eat or speak. He had never shown her much tenderness in life, but in death his grief was undeniable. Perhaps he had loved her in ways he could not show. Perhaps he mourned her as the anchor of his reign. Perhaps he mourned not only his wife, but the peace she had represented. Elizabeth was buried at Westminster Abbey, her effigy carved in alabaster, serene and eternal. Visitors still see her there, lying beside Henry, the mother of the Tudor dynasty, the rose that bound England together. But her silence lies with her, buried deeper than any tomb. And so we return to the question, did Richard III murder his niece? The answer, like the Tower itself, is shrouded in mist. There is no record of her imprisonment, no proof of his desire, no evidence of his hand in her survival. What we have are whispers, fragments, contradictions. Richard may have lusted after her, may have planned to wed her, may have intended her death, or he may have done nothing at all, leaving her as a pawn he never touched. What we do know is this: Elizabeth lived when her brothers did not. She endured when others perished. Her survival is the most haunting mystery of all. Perhaps Richard spared her because he saw her as useful. Perhaps he could not bring himself to kill her. Or perhaps, as some suggest, he never killed her brothers either. And Elizabeth's silence was the silence of ignorance, not complicity. We cannot know. History denies us certainty. But Elizabeth's life tells us something else, something deeper. It tells us that survival is its own kind of victory. She endured the fall of her house, the death of her father, the vanishing of her brothers, the rumors of her uncle, the suspicion of her husband, the loss of her son. And still she became queen. Still she gave birth to a dynasty that would rule England for more than a century. Still she shaped the future with her blood. The princess in the tower did not die there. She walked out, silent, watchful, carrying secrets that we will never fully uncover. She became the mother of kings and queens, the grandmother of Henry VIII, the great-grandmother of Elizabeth I. Her silence built an empire, and maybe that silence was her final answer. Not an accusation, not an exoneration, just silence, heavier than words, sharper than swords, eternal as stone.